Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our session at ISAP session Climate Security. Our session entitled as Climate Security in Asia Pacific, Key Issues and Challenges. We explore IGES new activity on this climate security and what the nexus between climate and security will infer to the political and policy landscape in this critical region of Asia Pacific. We have a session of 19 minutes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 good presentations along with some discussions. So after the presentations, we collect some questions from the floor for the discussion. So I'd like to invite you to actively participate in this session. So without further ado, I will start with the framing presentation, which will be delivered by myself. So please show my slides. Okay. So try to set the scene for today's discussion and try to introduce what the IGES will do in the coming 2 years and a bit to explore this new frontier for IGES. Go to the next slide, please. So we have launched a new initiatives. It's called IGES on Climate Security, and recently we named it as an Asia Pacific Climate Security Project, or APCS. You can access this website where we compile all the information and recent activities that we implement as part of this project. And this project is funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Japan, the research grant. Okay, next slide, please. So why is it critically important to think about climate security in an Asia-Pacific context? I'd like to draw an evidence from the recently released paper by the UNSCAP. It's called the Asia-Pacific Disaster Report 2023, entitled Seizing the Moment, where it strongly presents that the disaster risk and the security risk in Asia-Pacific indeed is quite deepening in the face of climate change. So climate change-induced disasters pose an increasingly serious threat to the Asia-Pacific. And it says that since 1970, 2 million people have lost their lives to disasters. And in 2022, over 140 disasters struck the Asia-Pacific region, leading to this amount of huge losses and damages. Go to the next slide, please. In response to such deepening impacts of climate change, and also its impacts on the conflict and social stability aspects, there is a growing attention to the concept of climate security. So scholars started to discuss about climate and conflict or social instability linkages with the deepening impact of climate change. And in 2007, the concept of threat multiplier was famously introduced. So in a security environment, there are many threats to security, such as COVID-19 or the Ukrainian war, or an incident in Gaza. But then the climate change will multiply such threat and make such threat more deepened and difficult to solve. Since then, even though the discussion in the UN Climate Security Council has lagging behind a bit due to the political difficulty to tackle this climate security issue, there is an international initiative to try to explore this front. For example, the G7 initiative on integrated approach to resilience, where in 2015, they issued a report entitled A New Climate for Peace. In A New Climate for Peace, importantly, there is a sketch of what kind of policy is needed for this climate security, which is called an integrated agenda for resilience. When talking about climate change, we often discuss risk and how to enhance the resilience of society. But this report importantly combined the resilience concept with climate change adaptation, development, and humanitarian aid, as well as peace building and conflict prevention. This kind of holistic and integrated approach is called upon by this report. United Nations also established a climate security mechanism in 2018, try to put together different branches of United Nations mechanism to tackle this climate security issue. So with these initiatives, there is a strong call for coherent and integrated policy approaches to this issue. The next slide, please. In the recently concluded COP28, there is also an initiative launched in this field. COP28, for the first time as a COP, has a dedicated thematic day by the presidency, which is for relief, recovery, and peace. And they issued a declaration on climate, relief, recovery, and peace endorsed by 80 countries and other stakeholders and organizations. In this declaration, they try to push forward the multiple actions in this front by covering 3 topics. One is increasing climate action and access to finance for communities and countries threatened by the fragility. And the secondly, to strengthen knowledge and programmatic solutions for climate action in such settings. And lastly, to foster collaboration at multiple levels and across regions, and humanitarian development, climate, and peace actors to address the multidimensional challenges of climate change. So as also outlined here, this field of climate security calls for the interdisciplinary actions by different stakeholders. And today, in our discussion, we also cover different sectors from very distinguished researchers to discuss about what kind of approaches are possible and what kind of gaps are out there in Asia-Pacific security context. The next slide, please. This is my last slide. So even though climate security is kind of new area for IGES to explore, we started to find some of the common questions that we can talk about throughout this project. First of all, we think about different conceptions of climate security, where climate security itself is a new concept in the security field. In the security field, there is already a concept such as national security, which is the most classic security concept, and also human security, international and collective security, or ecological security. When introducing climate security concepts to the climate change concept into the security debate, maybe states might prioritize national interests, but on the other hand, if we talk about transboundary or complex climate risks, maybe that can trigger more cooperative actions by different states. The second issue we talk about would be how the concept of climate security or discussion of climate security can facilitate, or on the other hand, constrain climate actions. Security concerns and risks have an effect on climate actions, and policy processes for security, on the other hand, such as development, humanitarian actions, peace building, and conflict prevention, can also be utilized for climate actions along with environmental policies. So this is exactly the new front where IGES as an environmental think tank can take a step ahead to think about more holistic approach to taking into account security and diplomacy policies on the ground. Lastly, but not least, there's an important dichotomy between risk and opportunity. When we talk about climate change, we sometimes put too much emphasis on climate risk. But rather, we can take climate risk as an opportunity to cooperate with each other and to enhance more cooperative collective actions in this complex global society. So how do we conceptualize the climate security to trigger more cooperative collective action is a key question that we will explore in the coming 2 years, and of course today's session. So with that, my quick flying presentation, I'd like to start with a keynote speech. Today, I invited Mr. Florian Krampe, Director of Climate Change and Risk Program, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or famously known as SIPRI. It's a very popular and well-known think tank in the field of climate security. It should be very early in the morning in your place, Florian, but thank you for waking up on time and be, well-dressed and be ready to present. Thank you so much. So Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Tanaka. Great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. It is indeed 5:39 in Europe at the moment, but it's nonetheless a great pleasure to join you this morning. As you mentioned, I'm director of the Climate Change and Risk Program at CIPRI, and maybe that is something to start with. Probably if you know the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, you know it for the work that CIPRI is doing on disarmament, non-proliferation, real hard security issues. CIPRI is working on the issue. No, I'm not speaking Japanese. CIPRI is working on the issue of climate security now since 2016. And if you look at it today, the Climate Change and Risk Program that I'm leading is the largest program of CIPRI, right? We're still doing all the traditional security work that we did, but we see increasingly a changing security landscape where climate change is one of the driving risk factors and security challenges that needs to be taken into account, and that we have to deal with. And I think you captured that in your introductory remarks as well. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is to give you an overview of the how we understand climate security risks, how they unfold, what we know of the issue, and as an institute that is working very closely with policy actors in translating the understanding of complex climate security issues into something that policymakers and practitioners can understand and utilize to prevent conflict and sustain peace, is sort of our focus. And then I'll dive a little bit into the opportunities that you also mentioned, because I think you're absolutely right, and it's a really fascinating project you're starting, and really important and timely. But we need to get the focus right. So the focus on opportunities as a combination with risks is really excellent. So what do we know about climate change and security? It's a long ongoing debate in academia, but there is absolutely no question that what we certainly know is that the double burden of climate change and conflict is increasing the hardship of already highly vulnerable populations, right? So before we are talking about causality in this relationship, which is difficult, and there rightly made different arguments around it, but we know and see increasingly situations where we see both conflicts unfolding and we see the increased pressures of climate change. And that is changing our responses. That is creating challenges for policy actors that are trying to resolve conflicts, that are working preventively. And it's creating difficulties for the climate community of facilitating climate action in these contexts. And if we take that over, if we take a map and put climate exposure on the one hand, and we take fragility on the other hand, and overlap those, we see that specifically large parts of Africa, but also the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia are becoming increasingly red. Less so in the Pacific region, because I guess from the conflict fragility element, we're seeing less there, but of course we're seeing tremendous impacts of climate change in that region. But we also see that, and you referred to the international debate, we see that the topic has increasingly been taken up in the UN Security Council, not because somebody wants to bring it there, but actually because we see that the conflicts that we are dealing with, where this overlap of climate change and conflict is happening, are so much more pronounced and are showing up on the UN Security Council agenda. And I think that is something that Japan and other countries are firsthand experiencing at the moment, being in the council. You see that when you take the number of UN peace operations, for instance, and you're overlaying that with climate exposure again, you see that 6 of the 10 largest UN peace operations are in areas highly exposed to climate change. Taking it a step further, that is 80% of all UN personnel deployed today in the world in peace missions that are in areas highly exposed to climate change. So these missions need to be ready. They need to get the mandate and the authority from the UN Security Council, which is the body that is deploying them. But we also need to build up the support system in the UN and in the different agencies to take this on, which is a unique space still. You mentioned the UN Climate Security Mechanism, which is composed, bringing together the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, UN Development Program, and the UN Environment Program. And it's still a very unique space. When we help facilitate the start of the mechanism in 2017, 2018, one of the key issues was realizing that, well, we have spaces to discuss climate change, but we do not have a space for climate security, because climate security is one of these funny concepts which lays somewhere in the territory of everyone and somewhere in no one's territory, right? So we're having a really difficult time to finding an institutional home for it, because we don't want climate security to be a core part of UNFCCC. At the same time, it can't be the only thing. The UN Security Council has to deal with it, but it can not only deal with it, right? And it can only deal with certain aspects of it. So we need to find these new institutional frameworks, and the UN Climate Security Mechanism is one of these unique spaces where we see that now, where actually today we're seeing a new development where we see climate hubs emerging in regions. Partially that is a dynamic that is emerging anyway. We see that regional organizations specifically have been taking up climate security issues, be it ASEAN in Southeast Asia, or be it IGAD in the Horn of Africa, or ECOWAS in West Africa. All of them have taken up the issue. And we see in the Horn of Africa now a dynamic where the UN Horn Office and the other institutional bodies with IGAD are coming together and are much more strategically synergizing around the issue, which is a really important point, because, as I will come to in a moment, is the way that climate security issues are playing out is extremely dependent on the context, which makes it really difficult. So if we take the causality question, as I said, so we can look at it from the double burden, and that is something really important. There is absolutely no question that the double burden exists. But also when we look at the causality, we see increasingly that climate change is increasing the risk of conflict and violence. But of course, climate change is not the only cause, right? There's no conflict that is caused by one single issue. So it is important to be humble and really focus on the contextual analysis, because depending on the different social, political, and economic structures and dynamics that we're seeing, we see that climate change is playing out differently. Our core take on that is essentially summed up under leaving nature out of our analysis means that our analysis is incomplete, right? And we need to have a complete analysis, as complete as we can get it, to make or to help decision makers in this space. The only slides that I'm going to show you is this one that I hope you can now see. It is our way of describing this relationship. It's a model that we have developed, and if you look carefully, you see that we're really avoiding putting an error in the last bit of the connection. That is simply because of the way we are thinking about this issue and the way that is playing out in different contexts. We see very clearly that the impact of climate change is primarily impacting people's vulnerability. The human security element of climate security is something really important. And depending on the social, political, and economic context, people's vulnerability will be differently affected, right? The problem we're seeing is that the impact that climate change has on people's vulnerability is creating opportunities for certain pathways to insecurity to play out. We have identified, looking at the research, and we have now replicated that in multiple regions, we have identified 4 pathways that I'll briefly talk about that are translating climate impacts that affect people's vulnerability into insecurity. The first one is deteriorating livelihood conditions. Very simple. The impact on people's livelihood is increasing grievances, is increasing the competition over scarce resources, and is playing out in multiple contexts in terms of insecurity, impacts on food security particular are something really to watch for. The second pathway is migration and mobility, and I'm sure everybody heard about herder-farmer conflict, where the impact of climate change is changing seasonal patterns, is affecting by that the dynamics in this space when people are moving with their cattle and the areas they are moving to, creating increasingly violent conditions that are playing out. Part here also is important to keep in mind is that part of the violence we're seeing related to changing mobility patterns is actually because of the existing conflict that we're seeing, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in these spaces, the change of cattle ownership, where it's not anymore your own cattle, but where you're essentially hiring young people to take your cattle out, or where leads are doing that, and we're creating these type of dynamics. The important part also with the migration and mobility side is that it reminds us that the security implications of climate change are not necessarily where the impact of climate change is, right? So especially with displacement and migration, we see that different parts of the country are going to see the security implications where people are moving. And that is something really important to keep in mind, because it's not, it just complicates the picture even more. What we're seeing in a lot of cases, we see that specifically in Somalia, but also in Mali and parts of, as well as Iraq and other places, is the use or is armed group tactics. We see that also in the Philippines, actually, in multiple ways playing out. Armed groups are increasingly able to capitalize on the grievances and the conditions that climate change is creating, and recruit for their strife, which is really problematic because it is hindering our peace building efforts in a lot of these cases. If you're being offered $500 to join an armed group, it's a very, very high incentive and a very high economic incentive. But we also see the social incentive, because if you were a farmer and you lost your livelihood because of the impacts of climate change, we're seeing that this loss of identity, this loss of your core livelihood, is something that armed groups are actually able to capitalize on and utilize by giving you a new sense of belonging, addressing you in that space, and so you're not joining an armed group because you're fully signed up to the ideology of this group, but actually you're joining because, well, it fills this need for social identity and sense of belonging. The last one, elite exploitation and resource mismanagement. In this mechanism, we see especially a lot of land right issues showing up. And I think that is the interesting thing with climate change. All the things we shoved under the carpet, right, and didn't want to deal with, like in large parts of Mali, you have 3 overlaying land rights, right? Traditional one, colonial one, and new national one. And that didn't really matter until now, but all of a sudden the available land to use is shrinking. And we're seeing that all these issues are playing out and elites are exploiting opportunities. We're seeing that in Bangladesh because of the land rights and displacement. People lose access to the land because elites are moving in and taking over the land. As a last point on this graphic, just the difficulty with all of this is that the same climate impacts are not going to have the same security outcomes. If we generalize, and I'm really generalizing here, we could say that, well, in a place like Somalia, we see specifically community level violence as a consequence of the impacts of climate change. In South Asia, we see especially mass protests and riots as a security implication of climate change. In Latin America, we're seeing crime, organized crime, and I think in the Asia Pacific region more broadly, we see also a significant element of geopolitical dynamics playing into the space and into the security dynamics. That said, coming to the lower part of this graphic is, and I think that is something that was mentioned in the introduction as well. If we look at this, if we look at climate security in this way and disaggregate it into these 3 pieces, we also see the entry points, and we see the need for integrated responses and integrated entry points. We need to deal with the security implications of climate change. That is a certain type of actors. But this is not the type of actors that's going to solve climate change, right? The military has certainly a role to play. It's not the primarily actor in this space, but it has a role to play. But it's not going to be sitting at COP. It's not going to really deal with people's vulnerability, right, in any meaningful way. So we need other actors. We need broader peace building and conflict resolution actors to help build the resilience of societies in the face of insecurity, but also work closely and on the link to people's vulnerabilities through climate adaptation, through development. We can't pretend that these are separate things, especially where we see this overlap. All of these things need to come together. And if we're not dealing with climate change in the first place, if we're not working on mitigation and reducing climate, on reducing emissions and reducing the severity of climate change, all of these things are going to play out no matter what we do, right? So we always have to do them. So we need a truly integrated approach that looks at climate mitigation, climate adaptation, development, as well as conflict prevention and conflict resolution in this space. So I've talked a lot about risks and I'm running out of time, but I think it's really important also here to look at the opportunities. And I think the entry points that I mentioned at the end are actually showing us the possibilities. And what we need, and where I think the COP declaration that was mentioned, as well as the UN efforts, the UN is making a tremendous effort in starting to address these issues and address them in a meaningful way within their peace-building frameworks. And we see increasingly that regional organizations are doing the same. And that is because if we take this graphic seriously, and if we understand that, well, we cannot just do one thing, all of this is connected through pathways, through these dynamics, how they're playing out, we're seeing that actually, if I'm doing these type of interventions, climate action is development and is peace building. And we have the opportunity to really bring these issues together, create a 3-in-1 deal, which is A, cheaper.
The time is 6 a.m.
B, more efficient. And it is simply much more timely and up for the moment that we need. And especially environmental peace building approaches, which are trying to use cooperation as an entry point, and really important as an entry point. It is not the end point. It is the starting point of facilitating engagement and exchanges and engaging in this space in a meaningful way and create peace positive outcomes is a real opportunity. But we need to bring these communities together. And that's why I think it's so interesting and important that IGES is taking this project up. Because in our work, we published a big report 1.5 years ago, the Environment of Peace, right? It takes a really big picture at these issues, looking at the security risk unfolding, how they are intertwined, but also at the risks of our interventions, of our actions related to climate change, and the risk of maladaptation, right? So we can create opportunities, but at the same time, we can actually really screw things up, because implementing a climate action and environmental projects in a fragile, conflict-affected setting is really difficult, right? And it's really something where we need to have much more learning between the peace-building actors and the environmental communities. We saw when we did the report in the uptakes that actually the security community was really taking the issue up. It was much more difficult for the environment community, specifically environment ministries, to get comfortable with this space, right? But at the end of the day, there's no way around that. We need to have all these actors on board. We need to come together, because there are these opportunities. There are these opportunities for a 3-in-1 deal of facilitating peace. But for that, we need to have conflict sensitivity of our climate action. We need to have climate sensitivity of our peace building action, and we need to have a much more significant exchange between different actors. And I think the Asia Pacific region specifically is a really interesting space where there's a lot of opportunities. It is a space where research has been done, but not enough research has been done. So it's really important to have more research in this space and work in this space. So I'm really excited and happy to be on this panel, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Florian. Indeed, or in the morning, I took a lot of notes. Actually, you touch a very good points, and as you mentioned, the environmental peace reports that you published a couple of years ago was actually something that I read when I applied for this fund, and it paved the context for our project indeed. And you touch upon that new institutional framework, and the important separation between people's vulnerability and the insecurity concepts, and that's a very important point to start a conversation with. So thank you so much. And although it's early in the morning, please, if possible, stay in the panel so that we can be engaged with you further in the discussion. Right, so now I go into the thematic presentations, where, as Florian mentioned, there are a couple of key issues that we speak about in our context of climate security, such as water, food security, and human displacement, among others, and energy security, of course. So we have 3 presenters in this session. And firstly, I again invite from virtually, Priyatama Singh, a lecturer in the Department of Science, University of Fiji, who will speak about a human mobility issue mainly in a Fiji context. So Priyatama, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Naoki, are you able to hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just give me a moment to share my slide. Okay, I hope you're able to see the PowerPoint mode now. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be able to present to you today. And my apologies in advance for the birds that are chirping just outside my office window. All right, so today I'll be basically highlighting on climate displacement issues in Fiji. I'll talk about some of the challenges, solutions, as well as some of the priority areas that we wish to focus on. So I'll very briefly discuss Fiji's vulnerability to climate change and some of the challenges that we have encountered during the process of climate-induced relocation, and key measures that the Fiji government has undertaken to address some of these challenges. And like I mentioned, a few priority areas that we wish to focus on before concluding my presentation. So very similar to other small island developing states, Fiji is, of course, highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And there are approximately 900 coastal communities that are highly reliant on the resources from the coast and from the ocean. So Fiji's high land area to coastline ratio and the coastal concentration of human settlements in these areas, plus our weakened coastal infrastructure and the heavy reliance on oceanic resources, makes us quite vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise as well as coastal inundation. But it's not just about threat to our livelihoods, not just threats to food security that we are facing, but it's actually a threat to ontological security as well. It threatens the climate change impacts are now threatening the very nature of being and the identity in vulnerable Fijians. And when I talk about Fijians, I talk about all the ethnic groups. They have this certain level of place attachment with their land, with their oceans, and to ask them to move to a new site is not a very easy process to navigate through. So, for instance, the indigenous Fijians that are mostly residing on the coastal areas, some of them have been earmarked for relocation. So they have been earmarked for relocation in another 5 to 6 years, and about 6 to 7 of the communities have already undergone climate-induced relocation. Some of these communities have fully relocated to a new site, and some are in the process, while in certain villages, due to place attachment, due to this spiritual and cultural connection to the land, it has been very difficult to relocate the entire community. So there has been some partial relocation in these communities. This diagram, I took this picture, way back in 2014 when we visited Vunindangulwa village. So this is the Vunindangulwa village head. It's a village in the second largest island in Fiji. The head of the village is showing erosion of the coastline that actually prompted them to relocate. And Vunindangulwa village was the first village in Fiji to be relocated as a result of the climate change impacts. So these communities, basically, they relocated 2 kilometers inland. And there were a lot of lessons learned from this first village that relocated, but I wanted to share a very short story about Narikosa village as well, which is located in Ono Island in Kandavo, Fiji. This relocation process actually was very challenging, and there were a lot of issues during the initial stages. So there was a bit of consultation between the communities and the government. And back in 2012, our Prime Minister, Mr. Frank Bainimarama, authorized the military to go to the village and help in the entire relocation process. But what actually happened is that the military started excavating the new site slightly inland and uphill. They excavated and flattened the area by cutting terraces and sort of leveling the hilltop with the use of dynamite on top of that. So what it did was it caused surface erosion and siltation of the near-shore ecosystem and started sort of damaging the mangrove flats, the coral reef system. And when these were observed and noticed by the villagers, they created protest and they asked the government to stop the entire relocation process. So everything basically came to an abrupt halt. So of course, it resulted in a lot of wastage of resources, and about approximately 300,000 Fijian dollars were already spent in this process, but everything had to be abruptly stopped. And then after that, there was a lot of consultations and a lot of analyses as to what had happened. And so it showed that there was lack of thorough consultation, of course, lack of technical assessment. So a lot of government agencies, even like within the government space, a lot of government agencies were not fully part of this relocation process. So there was, issues with horizontal integration even between the government agencies. And the stakeholder contribution was inadequate as well. So, it just basically goes to show that without cooperation and without having these different actors involved in the relocation process, relocation cannot happen. It's not that easy to relocate a community without having this high level of stakeholder input and contribution by the technical partners, by the research institutes, by the different government agencies as well. So I have given a reference here. It's a very nice paper if you would like to read about lessons from Narikosa village relocation, Fiji. So as far as challenges are concerned, relocation in Fiji is definitely not a straightforward process. It's so complex. And it can be met with a lot of resistance due to the spiritual, the cultural, and social ties that people have with their land and sea. For instance, indigenous villages, communities, they have their ancestral tombs in their villages. And if you're asking them to relocate, you're also asking them to uproot the burial sites of their ancestors and take those tombs to the new site as well. And they believe if they do this, then, they have a lot of spiritual consequences, which brings a lot of bad luck to them. So there are the social cultural implications, which is very difficult to navigate through. And it requires systematic, consistent back and forth with the communities. And of course, difficulties in ensuring proper compensation. Now, not all the communities that are earmarked for relocation in Fiji have a site or land of their own to relocate to. So, these land and these new sites may be owned by another tribe. And so you need to properly compensate these other tribes. And we're also talking about compensation for the villagers who are being relocated as well. So there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of negotiations that need to happen as well. And we need to provide the displaced communities with adequate support system as well, because they're moving away from the coastal areas. They have depended on the ocean and coastal resources for generations, and they're putting them into a new spot with new livelihood opportunities that will require them to undergo some, training as well. So it is about, emotional support as well for the displaced communities in addition to financial support. And then consideration of the psychological and social impacts, like I mentioned. This is part of the relocation process that is often overlooked, but I think it needs to be an integral component of the entire relocation process. And the failure to account for the significant variance that is involved with the context-specific needs of the community. So it's not just about the country as a whole, but different communities have their own unique challenges. There are specific needs which we need to address before the community can be relocated. Elderly in the villages, for instance, wish to remain at their original site, but they would like their children to move to the new site or gain education and move to safer places. So that's the sort of thinking that most of the community members have. And of course, the biggest challenge is to have a sustainable financial mechanism. So for For Fiji government, they have created a climate change relocation trust fund, which has about 3% of the revenue that comes from the environment and climate levy that we have here in Fiji. But it's mostly dependent on the support by the donor organizations and the development partners. And of course, the community that is relocating also need to provide some form of support, either financial support. At least 1/3 of the entire cost needs to be borne by the communities who are relocating. So that's an additional burden on that, on the community. Most of these communities don't have the financial resources. So, but they do have natural resources. For instance, they have forest areas. So they provide timber for the construction that is going to happen at the new site. So they're required to contribute in some form towards the relocation process. So there are a lot of lessons that we have learned from relocated communities. And one thing that we have realized is that planned relocation is obviously the last resort for Fiji. And so we are trying to intervene in ways to ensure that climate change adaptation is given more priority so that communities are able to adapt to the changing climate in the best way possible. This also includes sort of promoting and implementing nature-based solutions for the communities that do not wish to relocate at all. Fiji has published planned relocation guidelines some years back, but of course it had a lot of loopholes. It's something that you cannot prepare for. It was the first guideline that Fiji came up with, so it had a lot of loopholes that resulted in a lot of confusion and issues in the relocation process. But just last year, Fiji released its standard operating procedures for planned relocation, and that is a more structured and strategic document that provides guidance to relocation. Then the latest policy or legislation that we have is the Climate Change Act, which was launched just last year. And this actually recognizes that Fiji and the Pacific is facing climate emergency. And so, it requires rapid transformation to adapt to the effects of climate change. So I have a quote directly from the act, which says the minister, with the assistance of the Fijian Task Force on Relocation Displacement. So there is a task force which has been created by the Fiji government, and it now includes all members of the different government agencies as well as technical and NGO partners. And they must operationalize the Fijian planned relocation guideline through the SOP, which enables proactive process for addressing the risk of climate and disaster-driven displacement in Fiji. So coming towards the end of my presentation, some of the priority areas that we really wish to focus on now is the post-relocation monitoring and consultation, as well as evaluation to identify any long-term issues for relocated or host communities. So I think that's one of the research priority areas that we have with this project with the IGES as well, where we intend to visit Vunindangala village almost a decade later and see how they are coping with the new livelihood opportunities that they were provided with, and how they're coping being away from the original village site, and what have they been doing all these years and how it has helped them to move on. And of course, securing adequate funding and resources to support the upcoming climate relocation process, and not just relocation process. So obviously, there are certain villages that will need to be relocated. But we also trying to look into climate adaptation funding as well. And there is definitely a deficit of research in this area in Fiji and Pacific. So more post-relocation studies to update our national adaptation plan, as well as the planned relocation guideline. And something that our previous studies have revealed is we need to look into income diversification strategies for many of these coastal communities as well. And finally, climate change impacts and the current and future local implications of these impacts, basically now threatening the long-established social narratives and value systems in the Pacific. And community characteristics, the internal dynamics of the communities, their circumstances, their perceptions, their mode of living, their unique challenges, way of life, all these matters in climate change relegation process. And so these human-oriented approaches need more emphasis rather than just, some stepwise procedures, assessments, and policies, which may best provide a guideline and a framework. But we really need to work with the communities in a very systematic and consistent manner, rather than in some ad hoc way and relocate just because they're facing the challenges. And more frequent community-wide consultations to basically better understand the community dynamics. And NEP must now focus on strategies for income diversification. NEP is our National Adaptation Plan. We're looking into some of the strategies that will help us to maybe promote women into income diversification strategies, for instance, moving them away from their dependence on natural resources to encouraging them, providing them with some form of financial support so that they're able to move into other businesses like, small scale tailoring, baking, or weaving, which many Fijian women are smart in, or handicraft, and other sort of income diversification strategies that moves them away from the dependence on natural resources. And that's it from my end today. Vinaka, everybody, thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Priya-san, for your presentation. You touched upon a very important point of the community's view to this issue of human climate security and people displacement. And they take note of the idea of ontological security and the importance of identity and place attachment for those people that we cannot miss when debating this topic. Thank you. So we are running behind time a bit. So for the remaining two speakers, I'd like to ask to stick to 10 minutes limit. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Nadia, Dr. Nadia Hussain, Assistant Professor of Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, to speak as the Pakistan viewpoint. So I invite you, Nadia-san.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to begin with the one statistic that disturbed me. In 2022, 30% of the global population faced food insecurity. Considering the scale and frequency of climatic events, this is a figure that should give us pause. So if there's one takeaway that I can leave you with from my presentation, it is that these changes related to food security are unfolding in a deeply interconnected world, and that the problem in itself is very complex. Sorry, I need some help with this. Yeah. Essentially, what is food security or insecurity? It refers to availability, it refers to access, utilization, and then stability. Before we go deep into the topic, just basic facts that I'm sure everyone would know. Asia and Pacific is home to 60% of the world's population. And we have interesting cultures, diversity, demographics. Some countries have aging populations, some have youthful populations. And then 40% of all international migrants originate from the region, but mostly within their own countries. So what are the climate risks that we should think about? I won't go into details. There are major examples here, but essentially increasing temperatures, rainfall variation, pestilence, it is having immense impacts on crop production, staple foods like rice, maize, and such. Monsoon floods were an interesting part. Sorry, I'm having a problem with the clicker. Please bear with me. This is better. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So in the coming years, these changes will definitely, increase. Half the people, as I mentioned, perhaps are facing food insecurity in Asia Pacific. And this means more than 1 billion people. In terms of figures and in terms of variation within Asian Pacific, South Asia is struggling the most. And there's the gender aspect, 39% of women, and that was interesting for me, even in East Asia, which has developed economies. These are numbers which are affecting women all within, even if there is variation. Food prices are getting higher. We know all these things, COVID-19, war in Ukraine. These impacts are difficult to quantify, but they were quite significant. And what was interesting was that the average cost of food rose to almost $4 per day. Now imagine that the definition of poverty is, less than $2 a day. So how can people afford food? So almost 2 billion people in Asia and the Pacific could not afford a healthy meal. So we know all these things, perhaps, but worth repeating. So now we come to the part which was interesting to me, which is, okay, so this is what is happening, but what can be done? And here is the framing by IPCC in the 2019 report, which essentially means food security is an outcome of the food system. Food security is indirectly linked with climate and ecosystems to the socioeconomic systems. Adaptation measures and mitigation measures will help us. My proposition is that the extant framing simplifies the complexity of ground realities. And here's why. Number one, climate change is not the only cause of food insecurity. Food insecurity results from distribution and markets that create conditions where low-income populations are unable to access enough food. And we know this because we've had scholarship like Amartya Sen scholarship, which has been telling us that, famines, for instance, are not just occurring because there wasn't enough food. People didn't have access to legal resources, social networks of support and such. So the takeaway is that in addition to the biophysical aspects of climate change, it is important to pay attention to the socio-political and economic decisions and processes and systems that create vulnerability in the first place. Second, that social ecological systems are cascaded across time and space. Local systems are connected to the regional systems and the global systems and such. And one example that I can think of is the double exposure effect, which is that climate change is impacting us. It's connecting local and regional and global economies and ways of living. But then globalization has connected the local with the global. So, for instance, in Mexico, when agro-industrial modernization took place, there were some positive benefits and then there were some negative things. Agro-industrialists benefited from it, but small-scale farmers lost out. So these are things we should consider. Another example is the Arab Spring. This is a pretty contentious example, but I think our keynote speaker, as he pointed out, that there's not one factor which is causing conflicts. So similarly, 2011 winter droughts in China led to increase of wheat prices because the country bought wheat. And the impact on Egypt, which was the world's largest wheat importer in that year, was that bread prices went up. And when protests erupted in Tahrir Square, one of the slogans was about high bread prices. So these are different things we should consider when we're thinking about even food insecurity or security, that what is happening in one place may have impact in another place in different ways and in unforecasted ways. Thirdly, that if we revert back to this diagram, and we may think that food insecurity can be changed by increasing crop production. But we should make sure that when we are adopting those measures, that they don't deepen vulnerabilities. So The latest IPCC report is telling us that agriculture and food system are key to global climate change responses, especially when also thinking of the global house gas emissions. So we need to make production efficient, we need to make transport and processing efficient, and we need to focus on demand interventions. But when we are focusing on making agriculture efficient throughout the world, those processes can be corporate market driven. And in doing so, we need to be careful how they may impact small scale farmers, keeping in mind that 30% of the population is employed in agriculture, and they're mostly smallholder farmers. And 80% of the global food production is supposed to come from developing countries. These are places where there's already structural inequity. So in trying to make agricultural production efficient, we should ensure that we're not making small-scale farmers lose out. And in that sense, land issues are important, because when we think of agriculture, we have to focus on land. And land-based inequities already exist in many places. And so superficial policy responses should not marginalize already marginalized groups. The other thing is the pressure on renewable water resources from irrigation, which would become severe or even intensify. Lastly, cities are in the heart of action. Urbanization is driving massive changes in the Asian Pacific. At present, I think, I'm forgetting the numbers here, but more than 50% of Asian Pacific's population is expected to live in urban areas by 2030. So in 7 years, 5 out of 10 people will be living in cities. So we have to pay attention to cities as well, and how urbanization is impacting changes in agricultural production, as well as claiming on water resources. What was interesting for me was that in the 2022 FAO report on food security, they focused a lot on urban issues as well. So urban food insecurity is also as much to pay attention to as in the rural areas. And with this, I thank you all for paying attention to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia-san, for bringing us to the food security aspects of this issue. And you touch upon the very important point of the difficulty to locate the causality, and sometimes excellent framing oversimplifies the reality. And that calls upon the difficulty and the nuances that are needed for us to prepare the policy recommendations to do justice to all sectors of all sectors and all corners of society. So our last presenter would be Nanda Kumar Janaudanan, Deputy Director and South Asian Regional Coordinator of Climate and Energy, IGES. So I invite you, Nandu-san.
Thank you so much, Okano-san. And I would also like to thank the previous speakers, Florian, Priya, Nazia, and Okano-san. I've learned a lot from your presentations. And I also wanted to actually sort of use some of the points from your presentations in my observations. When we talk about climate security and the impacts, mainly our attention is sort of around migration, food security, and other environmental impacts. And somehow the focus on energy is sort of left out. And here, what I want to focus in this next less than 10 minutes is to give some sort of highlight some important points on the energy aspects related to climate security. In a traditional outlook, we understand energy security in the context of climate security as impact on energy sector due to increased conflicts that are climate induced. But probably there is a different aspect to that, is that what kind of physical damages happening to energy sector. And that is more important today because we are actually already moving from a fossil fuel-based economy to more of a clean energy based economy. In this context, it's more important for us to think about how our energy infrastructure is going to be affected by climate change and climate impacts. Here, I wanted to point out that extreme weather impacts are actually sort of a serious concern for climate change, energy sector. Be it refineries, be it oil and or gas or coal power plants. And so any of these having actually a serious impacts due to climate change and climate induced weather impacts. And the concerns about concerns that these facilities also heavily dependent on water supplies also sort of sort of a major concern. And the fact that most of the power sector is actually sort of consuming something like 88 cubic kilometers of water annually for energy production, that brings us to the attention focus that climate impacts can be extremely severe on energy sector. Okay, so especially on the clean energy sector, we also need to understand that some of the pictures are actually sort of self-explanatory here. How extreme weather impacts are affecting energy installations or energy infrastructure. And there is a greater importance we need to pay in building resilient designs, especially for solar or maybe wind or other renewable energy facilities. And the fact that even the rise in temperature also creates a lot of problem for renewable energy facilities, because the efficiency of solar plants, or even even the changes in wind speed and all this affect renewable energy production dramatically. In terms of what is the net effect of this impact of extreme weather events on energy sector? The net effect is that there's going to be substantial increase in energy consumption. So there's substantial increase in energy demand. I mean, we can easily understand that the kind of air conditioners usage which is going up actually in many countries. We know that this is sort of one of the major points where energy consumption, it can be taken as an indicator for energy consumption. And another important point I want to mention here is that the impacts on critical minerals. Probably many of us are actually now started getting into the field of, or getting to know about the field of critical minerals, because these are minerals that are extremely important for energy transition. There could be something like 30 to 50 minerals, depending on countries. These are actually extremely important for energy transition for many countries. And mining of these resources are sort of, it can be severely affected by weather changes or extreme weather events. Now, how to align energy policy in a world of climate crisis? Probably this is one of the areas where policymakers need to sort of understand, as well as design strategies in a way that energy related concerns are integrated into the climate policies, or vice versa. And I have actually mentioned here 3 different sets of different categories of actions which policymakers will need to pay attention. One is about strengthening energy sector's resilience. When thinking about building renewable energy facilities, we also need to think how this can actually withstand any sort of extreme weather events. And accelerating clean energy transition in a way that is adaptable to the local weather conditions and climatic conditions. And then also it's also important for us to think of fast-tracking policy adjustment, especially ensuring that those private sectors or those institutions that actually sort of are building energy facilities can be incentivized based on their resilience performance. These are actually some of the key points, but I'm not going to read through all these points because of the paucity of time. Now, resource diplomacy has actually been discussed in the climate security context in a traditional sense. But that is basically like, if climate change is impacting on energy or fossil fuel availability. How can countries strengthen their resource diplomacy to secure energy supplies? That is actually how we discuss resource diplomacy in a traditional context. But today, after the COP28, we have seen that the world is getting ready to move away from fossil fuels. So in that context, how do we make better policies that aligns with climate security impacts, as well as how do we make better resource diplomacy to fit into the newer context? So there are two boxes which I have shown. The first box is actually how we have been thinking in a context where fossil fuels were prioritized, but the box on the right-hand side actually talks about how do we need to, or what kind of strategies we need to devise as we move towards a clean energy-based economy. And here actually it's very important for us to sort of, you can actually notice that from a resource-intensive policy, we actually need to move towards a technology-intensive policy. With this, I'll stop this presentation here. Sorry, I'm not able to actually read through all the points because of the paucity of time, but I'll be happy to take if you have any questions. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nandu-san. And now we're done with all the presentations. And would it be possible to show the other panelists on our screen, if possible? And yeah, you work on it. So now we have, roughly 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. Actually, I have some discussion points, but if there are some questions from the floor, that would be better to engage with. So is there any questions? Please raise your hand. Any? That looks a little bit shy audience, I hope. Okay, please, thank you. Okay, sure, that's better.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm from Dai-ichi Life, a big life insurance company in Japan. And I have a question to Nazia on the food and agriculture systems. I understand that there are a lot of farmers in the world, which most of them are very small farmers. And to change agri-food systems, I think the maybe governmental policy or some action from large corporates, for example, Nestle or Coca-Cola companies like that, would be necessary to really, give influence to small farmers. So how do you think about the possible intervention or interaction by the governments or the large corporates? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I collect some questions. So I saw one more hand. Yeah, right there.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Yurika Mori from Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, one of the youth group based in Japan. So I just want to ask you the question about like technological development. I think regarding to food security, energy security, technological development is definitely focus point for anyway, but yeah, in the future. Then I just saw the news covered by Japanese media saying that was like solar panel development originally developed by Japanese scientists. But it is because those scientists has no money to apply for the international patent. They could eventually share the technological information with around the world. Then that leads to the development at the global level. It can be seen as like a loss for Japanese people. They kind of like a loss to gain money or whatever, but it can lead to the global level of the development on the other hand. What do you think about like that kind of like a patent level, or like what kind of like a thing is important to develop and accelerate the development of technology at the global level? Yeah, that's the question from me.
Thank you. So if there's no other questions, okay, Andre-san, please.
Thanks. Andre Moda from IGES. So a few of the speakers, especially Florian, were talking about the fact that climate change acts in combination with other factors. And this is a bit of a general and maybe abstract question, but how do we know to what extent climate change is having an impact, considering that it is interacting with all these other factors? And is there a danger that we may be overstating the effect of climate change so far, even if in future it's going to have a larger effect? Thank you.
Okay, so I think now we can start to answer. So maybe you can start with Nadia-san.
Thank you for the question. I can revert to my experiences in the Philippines where I'm doing field work. And what I found was that people are talking about privatizing water for agriculture. In urban aspects, in Metro Manila, for instance, water delivery is already privatized. So what was interesting for me was how privatization, corporate responses to things which affect so many people are being encouraged by governments. So it's not just that corporations swoop over and governments don't do anything. Governments are actually facilitating this aspect, and I can understand that from the point of view that the scale of the problem is immense, and governments do not have enough resources, and we can certainly say that for countries in the global south. So what could be perhaps one way that we can balance where small landholder farmers don't completely lose out? And I think that's where water justice issues would come in, that we include farmers, small-scale farmers in conversations about resources that are affecting them. What I've seen from my experience is that such things do take place, but they're not meaningful. And also that when we think of governments, we think that governments are neutral players, but people who are part of the social and political elite have their own interests. And in terms of governance, governance is a very political process. So when they are introducing these interventions, they are benefiting people who are part of that elite. So I would say that I think as a researcher, I would just perhaps go back to what Florian said, that we pay attention to contexts. One size fits all approach doesn't work. As people who have privilege, perhaps it is on us to make sure that marginalized people, people who don't have basic education, don't really lose out in this effort to make everything efficient.
Thank you. Nando-san, maybe you can.
Thank you so much, and especially the question on technology, it's extremely important. As we are moving from fossil fuel-based economy to sort of an alternative energy or clean energy-based economy, what we can see as a big thing happening here is that in the latter, technology is what is going to take the front seat. For example, if I give you an example, now we have been hearing about hydrogen, clean hydrogen or green hydrogen is increasingly becoming important in the new energy mix of different countries. It is especially important for Japan to highlight this point that Japan has 27% of global patents in Japan's own account when it comes to green hydrogen. So anywhere, any country or any institution is going to sort of develop hydrogen, definitely that is going to bring some sort of financial benefits as well as opportunities for industries in Japan. So similarly, solar energy, solar PV, Japan has been one of the leading players for a long time. And though the installation of solar PV is relatively less in Japan, the technology in terms of solar panels and the battery technology and the advancements in all these things, it is going to be the new resource. So you can actually say that technology is a new resource. And I also want to touch upon Andre's point about how do we sort of look at the impacts on climate impacts, and how do we say that this is related to different sectors and how the impact is there. I'll definitely leave it to Florian, but quickly I wanted to say that one example is that in nuclear energy sector, it's highly water dependent. And the number of outages that has happened in the nuclear energy sector from 1990 to 2010 is sort of, it was 0.2 in 1990, but by 2010, it was actually 1.5 outages per reactor. So there has been, and most of these outages have been attributed to climate impacts or climate-induced water shortages. So this is probably one way of looking at it. And I'm sure like Florian must be having a bit more examples here.
Thank you, Nandu-san. So Florian, if you can answer the last third question, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the question around accountability in terms of climate impacts is really interesting. Then I'm wondering, does it really matter? Because at the end of the day, we know climate change is unfolding, right? We know those impacts. The issue is that no matter where we are, they're playing out as a weather event, right? So that attribution is not for a political scientist to do, probably. I would leave to the natural sciences and make sure, I mean, prove that a specific weather event is related to it. But I mean, we know that the frequency, the magnitude of these weather events is increasing already today in pretty much everywhere. As far as I understand the climate science, I don't think there is. We are at a point where essentially any weather event is attributable or is having a climate impact within it, right? Or climate change impact within it. We have been talking about climate-related security risks because that's why I think I'm not sure it matters, because if it's a drought, it's a drought. If it's caused by climate change or not, doesn't necessarily immediately change responses, right? We're gonna need and have the same response in this space. Flood management, it's gonna be the same response, right? And we know then beyond that specific event, we know that the frequency and magnitude will increase, and we need to build up the infrastructure resilience, etc. We need to build up all these things. At the end of the day, you know, all of the points I was talking about, and I think most of the issues we're talking about are governance issues, right? So then you could say, well, nothing has to do with climate change. It's all governance. But then what is not governance, right? And I think that is something important to keep in mind. So I hope that answers the question, keeping in mind it's almost 7 a.m. and I didn't have coffee yet, so.
Thanks. So, Player, actually, most of the questions are going to the other speakers, but if you have any general observation after hearing the other presentations or else, please give some reflection. Actually, we are wrapping up in a few minutes, so I think I'll do the quick round of final remarks and comments. So yeah, any general reflection from yourself, from your side, will be appreciated. So Player, floor is yours.
Thank you, Naoki. I think looking at the presentations by different speakers, one thing that we can agree on is the contextualized nature of these impacts and how it is difficult to sort of apply a process or an approach that might be working in one country, but it may not work so well in the other country. So I think what we need is more home-based, localized approaches to tackle these various impacts of climate change. And I think, like Florian mentioned in his keynote speech, climate change is playing out differently in different contexts. And I totally agree with that, because we are experiencing different set of problems, and not just as a country as a whole, but within the different community as well. There are different community dynamics as well. So if we, for instance, from my experience, if I talk about climate-induced relocation, then it's not just, taking one SOP and using it and implementing it evenly across all the communities that need to be relocated. the communities out in the outer island, for instance, experience different set of challenges as compared to those who are on the mainland and maybe have more access to readily available resources. So the nature of climate risks and security are so localized and contextualized that we really need to increase this sort of research in different areas and contribute to global data accumulation through research. And I think that is something that is lacking in the Pacific region in particular. We really need to increase our research outputs on climate-related issues in Fiji and Pacific. Yeah, I think that's all from my end. Naoki, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Player, for this final remark. So now I give floor to Florian again so that you can go to grab coffee as early as possible. So yeah, provide your final remarks, please. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I mean, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity. It's really great to join you and to listen to the other presentations as well and have this discussion. I'm glad I'm not the last speaker, so I can actually do what I wanted to do. And normally I try to end on a hopeful note, right? But I thought, why not end on a more depressing note? The issues we're facing, climate security is really pressing. It's really important issues. But if that nightmare isn't enough, right? And you mentioned in your introduction the ecological security side. Gosh, we're going to be in for something, right? And we barely understand the weeds of it. From antimicrobial resistance to biodiversity loss tipping points through pollution, right? And the wider impacts of that. It's going to be a really tough ride. And the more research we do on climate security side, but also understanding the wider environmental and ecological security risks and how they're intertwined with everything, right? I mean, that the others mentioned, from the food security side to the energy security side, they are all going to come together. And we are already in a world that is already looking increasingly crazy. And we're going to be in this type of a world for much longer with new risks emerging. So we need to really get cracking on that.
Thank you for the note. That's very important to underline. So Nandu-san.
Thank you so much. I didn't have any more points.
Well, thank you. I think I'll just say one thing, that we need transformational approaches. We need multiple frameworks, multiple perspectives. And I think the question of causality is very important. So maybe going forward, we pay attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your brevity. And my apology for my bad time management. We couldn't have enough time for discussion, but at least we could touch upon some important points when we think about climate security and what kind of approach we need for this important front. So that brings me to the end of the session. Lastly, I'd like to invite Mr. Yasuo Takahashi, IGES Executive Director, for the closing remarks. So Takahashi-san.
Thank you, Okano-san, for your introduction. Good evening and good morning. I am Yasuo Takahashi, the Executive Director of IGES. Thank you for joining us today for this panel session, Climate Security in Asia-Pacific Key Issues and Challenges. Yeah, it is really exciting because I think this is the first time for IGES to have this kind of session on this subject. So today's session, distinguished panelists and IGES researchers have discussed the significance and implications of approaching climate change from a security perspective, based on a diverse range of topics ranging from energy, food and water security, and human mobility and displacement due to climate change. I believe that we are able to consider the importance of combining theoretical perspectives on climate security with local perspectives by closely examining cases from Fiji and Pakistan to accelerate responses to climate risks, including the risk of conflict and instability. This session, organized by the new initiatives of IGES, the Asia Pacific Climate Security Project, IGES has launched it this year, funded by a research grant from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. In the past, IGES has been working on climate change mainly from the viewpoint of environmental policies. This project aims to provide a new perspective on climate change from the perspective of diplomacy and security, such as development, humanitarian actions, peace building, and conflict prevention. Bearing in mind the deepening risks of climate change on social instability and conflicts, I believe that this is an essential perspective for an integrated and consistent approach to climate risk. The project will continue until the fiscal year 2025, and I would like relevant researchers, policymakers, and stakeholders to become interested in and to engage with this project. Finally, I would like to sincerely thank all the speakers for their excellent contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takashi Shocho, and that concludes our session. So please give the final hands to our excellent speakers.